Before we begin today's show, I want to make a few official statements. Number one, I don't want to die. I have no desire to take my own life, and if I die in the next few weeks, you know who did it. Number two, you can independently verify all of the facts presented in the show by visiting the resources in the show description. And number three, all opinions presented on this program are solely those of the producer and host of the Conspiracy Files, aka me. All parties are considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. And with all that said, let's do a deep dive. Welcome back to the Conspiracy Files, everybody. I am your host, Colin Browen from Murder in America and the Paranormal Files. It's been a while, guys. I haven't recorded an episode of the show in a few weeks. We've had a lot going on. Courtney and I moved into a new house, and as you can see, if you're actually watching this show, the background behind me is completely redone. I've added a bunch of stuff. If you've been wondering, most of these things are original relics from conspiracies. I mean, you've got back here the son of Sam, who I don't believe acted alone at all. Just a lot of different relics and things from cases that we already have covered or are going to eventually cover. But today's show is dark. It involves a double homicide that is very suspicious, and I think you guys are going to enjoy it. This is definitely a story that a lot of people have heard before, but it's also a story that deserves to still be talked about because there's no real resolution here. But without further ado, let's hop right in. On August 23rd, 1987, in Alexander, Arkansas, two teenage boys, Don Henry, 16 years old, and Kevin Ives, 17 years old, left to do some late-night hunting. At some point in the early morning hours, their hunting trip would become a tragedy. At noon on August 23rd, Don's dad, Curtis, received a phone call that the boys were found shot and tied to the railroad tracks. He contacted Kevin's mom, Linda, and they both met with the police at Don's house. The police informed Linda that there was no indication that the boys were shot. The authorities eventually told the parents that the boys had been fatally run over by a train at 4:25 a.m. The train was going 50 miles an hour and dragged their bodies over half of a mile. There were 19 grams of cannabis found on Kevin, and the original theory from the police is that the boys high on cannabis died accidentally or they killed themselves in a suicide pact. The boys' parents did not believe this was the case. Now, on the show, what we like to do is make sure that we back up everything with fact. So if I make a statement in this program, it is going to be backed by evidence, whether those are police reports or old evidence files or even newspaper reports from the time. All this stuff is founded in fact, and we like to break it down. There's a couple segments on the show. First, we're going to start off with the official story, then we're going to move into the conspiracy and why these boys may have been killed, and then at the end, we're going to provide you with some evidence. So stick with me. This is a very dark one. So we first get to the initial investigation. Saline County Sheriff James Steed conducted this initial investigation. The crime scene was not taped off and not treated like a proper crime scene, and not all of the body parts were collected. I mean, this is a weird thing. One boy's foot was left at the scene and retrieved later, so there's already some sloppy police work in here where they're not sealing the scene, they're not preserving any evidence that might be there. They're practically, I don't know, you come across these things when it comes to conspiracy theories where, oh, the police left the crime scene unattended for 5 days and, oh, who knows what happened. Why do they leave it unattended? You don't see that sort of a thing with other murders or crimes like this, especially one where two boys are killed. It's strange. So Curtis, one of the boys' fathers, asked a friend who was a hunter to go out and examine the tracks himself. He found little blood on the tracks, and medical staff also noted this fact, so already it looked like the boys weren't hit. But who were the witnesses that were on this supposed train? Well, the conductor saw a dark spot on the tracks 10 to 15 cars down them. When the train was approximately 100 feet from the dark spot, the engineer, Schroyer, blew the whistle and hit the emergency brakes. Apparently, the engineer saw two young men lying between the rails. There was something covering the boys from their waists to just below their knees, which some people think is a tarp, and both boys were right beside each other with their arms and hands to their sides. No movement was noticed at the time. And the tarp being over the boys' legs was mentioned a number of times to police, but the officers claim they were never even told there was a tarp. Already, there's so much in question. These boys, the police and authorities are claiming these boys were hit by a train and killed. Seems like a terrible, tragic accident. But then through some independent research, we're starting to see inconsistent facts, inconsistent evidence, and a lack of blood on the rails. You'd imagine if a human body was hit by a train on those train tracks, there would be a significant blood loss. But according to multiple people, there was no blood really. So what did the medical examiner, Dr. Malak, have to say? Well, tests taken soon after the accident stated that there was no alcohol in the boys' systems. The drug tests took 2 weeks, and once the drug tests were received, a statement from the medical examiner's office said that the boys were rendered unconscious and in a deep sleep on the railroad tracks under the psychedelic influence of THC when a train passed over them, causing accidental death. I'm sober now. I've been sober for 8 months. I have partaken in a lot of the devil's lettuce, or whatever you would like to call it. I want to dance around it with censorship. It definitely does. There's no way that you can get high enough to go walk out on some train tracks and lay down on them and not move when a train's coming. I mean, that's just suspicious. So the medical examiner did not mention in this report the lack of blood at the crime scene or the color of the blood that was found. And what did the police have to say about this? Well, Rick Elmendorf, the chief deputy in Saline County, stated that they hadn't ruled anything out except foul play. They had ruled that out. This was not a murder. The police wanted you to know that. But what about the first responders? On February 16th, 1988, Saline Memorial Hospital staff gave their impression of the scene. So the official hospital report includes notes for paramedic Shirley Raper. Blood from the bodies and on the body parts we observed was dark in color in nature. Due to our training, this would indicate a lack of oxygen in the blood and could pose a question as to how long the victims had been down/dead. Staff noted that there was an absence of fresh blood that is normally found at trauma sites similar to this one, and none of the blood appeared to have dried. In testimony at the investigative hearing, Shirley Raper stated that while she was attempting to drive the ambulance out a secondary road, she came across a pickup truck that was occupied by 3 people. Now, due to the public outrage about Linda being blocked from getting a second opinion, the media then began their own investigation into Dr. Malak. So already you've got different accounts. First responders are saying the blood looks weird. The medical examiner is saying something different. The police are saying something different. But the one consistent thing that authorities are going for is that this wasn't a murder. Why? How do they know this so quickly? I mean, it's definitely a little peculiar, right? And that makes me question, did Dr. Malak have any other rulings that were inconsistent or incorrect? Well, police investigators and a county coroner stated that they had been involved in cases where their findings countered Dr. Malak's findings. In one case, Malak had ruled a shooting as a suicide, when the investigators and coroner ruled it as an accidental death. Now here's where we get into this. We're going to see Bill Clinton and the Clinton family come up a lot in this story. But we got to first examine Dr. Malak to see if Bill Clinton himself had any ties with him. So did Bill Clinton have ties with Malak? Well, there was a conflict of interest because of a ruling which came between terms when Clinton was out of office. You see, Malak had helped Bill Clinton's mother avoid legal scrutiny in one patient's death as she was defending herself in a medical malpractice lawsuit arising from the death of one of her patients. At the time, Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas. And assumedly because of this, governor of Arkansas at the time, Bill Clinton, and his board refused to fire Dr. Malak, even with 4 years of public criticism of his work. Now, after a grand jury overruled Dr. Malak in the Ives-Henry case, Clinton hired 2 out-of-state pathologists to review Dr. Malak's work. They gave him high marks and said he should get a raise. These pathologists were paid $20,000 from Bill Clinton's discretionary fund. Bill Clinton then sent a proposal to the legislature to raise Dr. Malak's salary by 41.5%. 3 weeks before Clinton announced his presidential candidacy, he pushed Malak to resign. But even though he was being pushed to resign, that wasn't the end for the doctor. In fact, the Clinton administration found him another well-paying job in state government. So this doctor was well in the deep pockets of Bill Clinton and the Clinton family in Arkansas, arguably the most powerful family in all of Arkansas at the time. He helped Bill Clinton's mother. Bill Clinton himself stepped in and helped Dr. Malak. They helped each other. So already there's some high strangeness there. But what did the parents of the victims have to say about the investigations? Well, they weren't satisfied, for sure, with how the investigations were conducted. They didn't rule out murder. and all the parents in the equation agreed that the deaths were never investigated for a second as homicides. The parents, in fact, requested a second opinion on the test results. They hired an out-of-state pathologist, and they were told that the fee they would have to pay was $200 per hour. They never received a bill from this pathologist. He did not repeat any of the tests or new tests that the parents wanted done, and his findings agreed exactly with those of Dr. Malak's. The parents also obtained court orders authorizing the release of all data, information, and tissue samples from all agencies involved, as they wanted second autopsies conducted. The state crime lab was the major obstacle in getting these results. So the parents were told by experts and other authorities that nausea and other discomforts would prevent a person from smoking enough marijuana to be rendered unconscious. They were also told they would have had to have smoked as many as 20 joints prior to 4:25 a.m. for this to occur. That's a lot of doobies. But on February 8th, 1988, parents Curtis and Marvell Henry and Larry and Linda Ives said that they were seeking a grand jury investigation. The parents of the victims feel like not enough is being done. Initially just blown over. I mean, just look at all these documents. Essentially, these two young boys are found dead in a brutal way. And they say, oh, they just smoked a lot of weed, went and laid on the tracks and died. And that's it. We're not going to investigate this any further. That's all that we're going to talk about it. And oh yeah, remember, it is not a homicide, which doesn't really make sense when you consider how criminal proceedings usually go. The parents of the victims then start to seek a grand jury investigation. So the Saline County Prosecuting Attorney's Office then held an open investigative hearing. Richard Garrett, the deputy prosecuting attorney, felt as though it was a premature move to call a grand jury investigation and thought an investigation could be done simply within Arkansas. For this hearing, 32 witnesses were subpoenaed. And prior to the results from the grand jury investigation being received, a deputy prosecutor was named by Garrett, as he believed that the deaths were indeed homicides. Dan Harmon was assigned as a special deputy prosecutor. This is where Dan comes in. So the grand jury investigation, this is where things start to go off the rails, if you catch my drift. So the boys' bodies, looking at this stuff closer, were exhumed. And an Atlanta medical examiner, Dr. Joseph Burton, conducted a second examination on the boys' corpses. Based on his examination, he found that the boys had only smoked a few joints before their deaths. He stated that Don Henry had been stabbed in the back, and Kevin Ives' skull had been crushed prior to them being placed on the tracks. 6 of Dr. Burton's peers agreed with his findings. And so, on September 9th, 1988, a grand jury finally ruled the boys' deaths as homicides. So at this point, a grand jury is basically, I don't know how to explain this lightly, but it's a legal entity, a group of peers that come together and they decide if they should prosecute or pursue charges or open investigations. So when they're looking into this with the grand jury, they're trying to see if they want to prosecute someone, they want to bring charges. They're trying to see if it's worth pursuing this as a criminal case. I hope I boiled that down. But grand juries can easily be deceived. We've seen this so many times, especially in stories of cover-ups. I hate grand juries. They're a terrible thing for the legal system. And especially when it comes to this grand jury, you're about to see how twisted all of this is. Because this is where we start getting to the suspicious deaths and the disappearance of witnesses before they could testify before this grand jury. Keep in mind at the time, tensions are high in Arkansas. Lots of people think these boys were murdered. Nobody's telling the truth. The authorities aren't telling the truth. They're obviously trying to cover for something, and people are starting to wake up to that fact. And so when this grand jury stuff comes about, the people who are covering this up probably feel threatened, and they want to make sure that this never gets out, the truth never gets out. And they would make sure that that happened. That's when we get to the deaths. So on November 10th, 1988, Keith McCaskill, an informant in the Ives and Henry train deaths, was found in the carport of his home, stabbed to death and covered with a curtain. Nothing inside of his house was disturbed, and it was determined that robbery was not the motive. The police believe that the death is unrelated to the boys on the tracks case. Prosecutors Garrett and Harmon met with FBI investigators after this murder, but there was no confirmation if the meeting had to do with the boys on the tracks. So this guy Keith, who is an informant in the case, who has some good information, who's going to come forward to the grand jury, is found murdered while this is all heating up. Wonder what he would have told people. Earlier that year, in May of 1988, a man named Keith Coney died. Keith had actually been the one who saw Don and Kevin, the victims, on the night that they were killed and placed on the train tracks. Keith had told his dad, other family members, and friends that 2 police officers had killed Kevin and Don before they were placed on the train tracks. He said that he saw this with his own eyes, that the police were responsible for the murder of these 2 boys. 2 days after telling his friends and family this information, Keith Coney was murdered. His throat was slashed, and when he tried to flee from his attacker on a motorcycle, he lost control of the motorbike and crashed. No autopsy was ever performed on Keith Coney, and I believe that murder is still unsolved. January 1989, Greg Collins failed to appear after being subpoenaed to testify before the Saline County grand jury. He had some evidence to share in the Boys on the Tracks case. As it turns out, Greg Collins had recently been murdered by a shotgun blast to the face, making him unable to testify at the grand jury. Then in March of 1989, Booney Bearden, another person who was going to testify in front of the grand jury, disappeared. To this day, his body has never been recovered. An article of his clothing was found in the area where an anonymous caller claimed his murder had taken place, but he's never been found. This anonymous caller has never been tracked down. Nobody knows what happened to Booney Bearden. And as it turns out, Booney was a friend of the last 2 victims who were also murdered, Coney and Collins. So now you've got 3 people that are going to testify in front of this grand jury who have information about what happened to the boys on the tracks. They're all dead, and they're not just dead, they're murdered. Now we're going to jump forward a little bit. April of 1991. Jeff Rhodes is another local man from Arkansas, and one day he snaps. He decides to come clean. He tells his family members that he knows too much about the murders of both the boys on the tracks, Kevin and Don, and another guy named McCaskey. Jeff Rhodes says he knows what happened to the boys on the tracks. He's frantically telling them this. He seems to be anxious. Shortly afterwards, Jeff Rhodes is found in a dump. But not only is he found in a dump, he's found with a shotgun blast to the head. His head is almost blown completely off, and his remains are actually on fire. After telling his own family members that he knows what happened to the boys on the tracks, this man, Jeff Rhodes, is assumedly abducted, shot in the face, driven to a dump, and then set on fire. But it doesn't end there. June of 1990, a man named Jordan Kettleson is found in his vehicle dead from a shotgun blast to the head. But this isn't a random murder. See, Jordan Kettleson allegedly had information about the murders of the boys on the tracks and the murder of McCaskey. So he had information once again on 3 murders. But before he could come forward with this information, he was found dead. Like I said, a shotgun blast to the head. This is still an unsolved murder. All these murders are still unsolved. And in June of 1995, a man named Mike Samples was shot. Sources claim that Mike participated in retrieving drugs dropped from airplanes in the area. And we're going to get into this theory with the airplane drug drops and everything that was going on with all of that stuff in the area and how that's tied into this story. But just keep that name in mind. June 1995, Mike Samples is shot. He's allegedly involved in the area with drugs being dropped from airplanes. But to this day, the authorities deny any connection between Mike and the murders of Kevin and Don, the boys on the tracks. But back to the investigation. So there you've got, I believe, 5 or 6 very suspicious unsolved deaths, unsolved shootings. Even the guy who had his throat slit and was chased down the road. No one's ever been able to figure out who was chasing him down the road or why. Those are just things that in this investigation just get glazed over. Don't really matter to investigators for some reason. So the grand jury investigation. $8,000 out of $16,000 of Sheriff Steed's office drug enforcement fund went towards the Saline County grand jury investigation of the boys' deaths. Strange that they're using drug enforcement money for these murder investigations. At a December 2nd, 1988 grand jury hearing, one of the individuals testifying was Troy Lee Warner, an inmate at the Saline County Detention Facility awaiting sentencing for drug charges. Warner previously had a federal court trial which included allegations that drugs involved in his dealings, drugs that he had been dealing on the street, he'd gotten those drugs from the Benton Police Department. A federal drug informant, David Zinnerman, was also a witness at the hearing that confirmed some of this information. So after this inmate testified about getting drugs literally from the police to go back and sell on the streets, an internal affairs investigation was conducted at the Benton Police Department regarding these allegations of gross negligence regarding participation in a reverse buy operation conducted by the police department in November 1987. Prior to the internal affairs investigation, one of the police department's detectives, a man named Robert German, was charged with 5 criminal counts. 2 for the possession of a controlled substance, 2 for the delivery of a controlled substance, and 1 for theft of property. Robert German left the police force before the investigation began. You could say somebody might have tipped him off and let him know what was happening. Another officer associated with this reverse buy drug dealing operation, a man named Lieutenant Bob Holliday, was suspended in July 1988, which was then followed by a medical termination. So they basically didn't face serious charges for drug charges that would get people sentenced to decades in prison. Special Deputy Prosecutor Dan Harmon then resigned from the Civil Service Commission on November 14, 1988. Dan Harmon, the prosecutor and the grand jury, wanted faster action at the time by the Benton Police Department in their internal investigation. It seems like they were dragging their heels waiting to investigate their own. The Benton Police Department was eager to investigate all sorts of petty criminals and bust people for dealing dope, and yet it took them forever to look amongst their own, to look into their own ranks, to weed out the rats and weasels from within. It's also a fact that Dan resigned immediately after meeting with Police Chief Rick Elmendoff. So here's how this drug dealing went down in Arkansas within the police department. Allegedly, there was an improper release of drugs from the Benton Police Department's evidence locker by that officer German, who then handed over the drugs to an FBI informant, a man named Teddy Carter. Teddy Carter was then supposed to sell these drugs in an undercover operation. March of 1990, Jean Duffy was appointed head of the 7th Judicial District Task Force, which was a joint federal and tri-county probe into the epidemic of narcotics trafficking in central Arkansas. And her supervisor, strangely enough, said that she could use her powers to investigate just about anybody in the state. You can go after big drug dealers, cartel members, you can go after anybody. But she could not use the drug task force to investigate any public official. Now that's a little bit strange, isn't it? Why are public officials above scrutiny by the police? So Jean Duffy then began to link Dan Harmon and other public officials to this illegal drug activity. So immediately, Jean didn't listen to what this guy told her not to do, and she began to link Dan Harmon and other public officials to illegal drug activity. The evidence that she collected went to the Assistant U.S. Attorney, Bob Govar. Govar was heading a federal grand jury investigation of public corruption in Saline County. And at this time, Dan Harmon, began to launch a smear campaign against Jean Duffy. So Jean Duffy's task force interviewed people living near where the boys were murdered. One investigator discovered that drug drops had been rumored in that area over the 6 months before the boys were found dead. Citizens had filed reports of low-flying aircraft flying over their houses in the middle of the night with their lights on. Officers would then go out and take reports for these complaints, but no investigations were ever done. So there were these reports flooding in this small town for months prior to when these boys were killed, that there were people flying aircrafts, very, very low aircrafts over the town and dropping drugs all over town. And the police just got these reports, even though they were coming from dozens of different people, all talking about the same thing. And they just thought, whatever. Don't need to look into that. In Jean's investigation, she also came across a confessed drug dealer who testified that she participated in an officially sanctioned drug ring and had picked up cocaine that had been dropped off in the same area that the boys on the tracks were killed in. So Jean is uncovering all this information. A drug dealer is saying there is a ring of drug dealers in the area that goes all the way up to public officials. You've got this drug corruption inside of the Benton Police Department. You've got people saying there are airplanes flying low over town and people hearing about drugs being dropped. All this drug talk. And what comes after this investigation? Well, in November 1990, Jean's anti-drug task force was dismantled. Nothing came out of it. And in December of 1990, Jean took her task force evidence to U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks, who said he would continue the investigation. Chuck seemed like he was going to take this to the next level. He promised Jean, I will make sure something happens here. Instead, he shut down the grand jury probe of Saline County public officials, and allegedly, he shut down the grand jury in exchange for a federal judgeship nomination from President George H.W. Bush. So a lot of liars in this case, a lot of people omitting the truth, not telling the truth, and actively trying to hide the truth. So in 1991, U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks, that guy who shut down the grand jury, held a press conference and cleared publicly all Saline County public officials and insinuated that the grand jury made that decision. See why I don't like grand juries? A few of the grand jurors contacted Jean, letting her know that they were ready to indict Dan Harmon, but were sent home without being allowed to even vote. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's not how a grand jury is supposed to work. They're supposed to vote on something, and then their vote is supposed to count towards whether they're going to indict people. But apparently you had members that were wanting to indict individuals, and yet they publicly said everyone is cleared, and the grand jury shut down, and they don't indict anybody. In 1994, the FBI opened their own investigation into the boys' deaths after they interviewed a witness who saw Dan Harmon on the tracks with Kevin and Don the night they were murdered. Now this is where the story gets wild. This witness passed a polygraph test and was put into protective custody. In June of 1994, Jean, Linda, the FBI, and investigative reporters began sharing information between each other. And this is when the connection between the murders and the Mena Intermountain Municipal Airport began to develop. So at this point, we need to talk about this municipal airport, the controversy around it, and how the plot is about to thicken. So the Mena Intermountain Municipal Airport is located close to the city of Mena, Arkansas, in Polk County. Its primary focus is on private aircraft, and it does not have a scheduled commercial air service. So this is a small airport for private planes only. So you don't have United, you don't have American, you don't have Spirit flying in and out of this airport. It's strictly for private operators, people who own their own planes, private jet companies, farmers, people like that. And this airport is known worldwide as the central location where illegal drug shipments and weapons transfers occurred during the Iran-Contra conspiracy/affair. So this airport is already famous because this is where millions of pounds of drugs and thousands of illegal weapons were being flown out of and imported into America. In 1982, the police in the town of Mena learned that a major drug smuggler was operating out of their airport. They reached out to the Arkansas State Police and other investigators, but even with reporting this, the federal government didn't want to stop the smuggler. They refused to even act. You had locals saying there's somebody smuggling thousands of pounds of harmful drugs through our airport in and out of the country. Federal government does nothing. During the 1980s, you see a large drug smuggling, money laundering, and arms smuggling ring was being ran by Adler Berryman, Barry Seal. And this Mena airport was the alleged base for his drug smuggling, weapon smuggling activity. The Barry Seal story is pretty crazy itself. There's a great movie where Tom Cruise plays Barry Seal. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but I enjoyed it. The Arkansas State Police, after learning this, began to believe that every time Barry Seal flew a load of drugs in for the U.S. government, that he flew 2 loads in for himself. Other allegations surrounding this airport are that the CIA used the airport as a base of operations to train pilots and troops for intervention in the Nicaraguan uprising by the Contras in the 1980s. So there's a lot going on here at this airport. There's illegal drug smuggling being run by the government, the U.S. government. They're not stopping it. They want it to happen. You've got rumors that the CIA is using this airport to train secret soldiers to fly into conflicts we don't belong in. And all in all, it's estimated that $3 to $5 billion worth of drugs were smuggled through the Mena airport over time. And so Barry Seal was running his drug smuggling operation out of this airport, but many people have said that for part of this time while he was smuggling these drugs, Barry was working closely with the CIA and DEA. The collaboration between these groups and Barry's goal was to expose involvement of the Nicaraguan Sandinista regime as a major supplier of cocaine from Colombia. Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton all faced criticism over the alleged illegal actions at this specific airport. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee stated that all charges and cases dealing with Barry Seal and others with ties to the airport were dropped due to potential national security risks. George H.W. Bush didn't try to prosecute any people involved in the drug smuggling or arms dealing during his term as president, and any individuals in the public eye that had a connection to the airport made no effort to investigate or prosecute anyone involved. Now, I'm not sure if anyone, I could be wrong, but I don't think anybody ever really was convicted for any of this drug smuggling. I mean, you got $3 to $5 billion worth of drugs being smuggled in an airport. Nobody goes down for it. The government at that time was busy with the war on drugs, imprisoning tons of nonviolent offenders because of drugs, and yet they're publicly smuggling billions of dollars worth of drugs. Doesn't really make sense, and it kind of pisses you off. So, October 7th, 1994, Bill Clinton is asked at a press conference about Mena whether he was told about the activities that occurred at the airport while he was the governor. Bill, of course, stated he wasn't told anything about the drug smuggling at the airport, and in a further comment, Bill Clinton said the alleged events, quote, were primarily a matter for federal jurisdiction. The state really had nothing to do with it. The local prosecutor did investigate based on what was in the jurisdiction of state law. The rest of it was under the jurisdiction of the United States attorneys, who were appointed successively by previous administrations. We had nothing, zero, to do with it, end quote. So Bill's saying, whatever happened there wasn't our fault. We knew nothing about the billions of dollars worth of drugs that were being smuggled in the airport by the United States government, even though I'm the top United States government official in the state. Weird. In 1988, the prosecuting attorney for the district encompassing the Mena airport, the land around this airport, issued a press statement complaining that the drug trafficking investigation had been thwarted because of links between the criminals' activities and the, quote, private wars conducted by the Reagan White House, end quote. So you've got Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan up there, war on drugs, drugs are bad, we need to stop drugs. And they're involved in smuggling billions of dollars worth of drugs into our country. Definitely makes you, I don't know if you guys are Reagan fans out there, but this is the type of shit that really makes you go back and look at a person holistically. And it's just like they all lie. They all lie. Then we get to the CIA involvement with this airport. A report that was commissioned by Republican Congressman Jim Leach of Iowa, chairman of the House Banking Committee, contained information from the CIA's Inspector General's office acknowledging that the CIA did have a hand in activities that occurred at the Mena airport. These admissions included that they conducted a 2-week-long joint training operation with another federal agency at Mena Intermountain Municipal Airport. They used the airport for routine aviation-related services on agency equipment. And they did so much more. A former Arkansas State Police trooper, a man named L.D. Brown, was actually a CIA applicant who wanted to work there in 1984, and his application was rejected near the end of that year. The CIA also admitted that their personnel had had limited contact, that's a quote, with Barry Seal, that major drug trafficker and federal informant who worked out of the same airport. 2 individuals, Terry Red, who was a former CIA operative, and L.D. Brown, that state trooper who actually had worked security detail for then Governor Bill Clinton, went public with claims that they knew of CIA involvement at Mena Airport. So Terry Red and L.D. Brown is rejected by the CIA. I don't know if he's got a bone to pick with them, but they decided to blow the lid off of this whole thing. So L.D. Brown, who had once worked for Clinton's security detail, he was Bill Clinton's bodyguard when he was governor, he stated that while he was being considered by the CIA for employment, he was taken on 2 airplane rides from Mena to Honduras. He claimed that he witnessed Nicaraguan Contra rebels as they were given M16 rifles in exchange for quantities of cocaine, which were then flown back from Nicaragua to the United States airport in Mena. So L.D. Brown, in his testimony, then said that after he was taken to Nicaragua, he saw American operatives trade guns for cocaine. He was then flown back to America. He saw the drugs coming into the Mena airport in Arkansas. He then went to Governor Bill Clinton, who he was Bill Clinton's bodyguard. He was assumedly somewhat close to Bill Clinton, and he told him what he had seen. He saw millions of dollars worth of drugs being flown into his state. But according to L.D. Brown, Bill Clinton wasn't surprised. It was almost as if he already knew that this was going on. Keep in mind, in that statement, Bill Clinton says he had nothing to do with this and he knows nothing about it. Now, in 1984, the CIA director, William Casey, suggested that Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North organize a covert transportation system to supply weapons to the Contras, that rebel group in Nicaragua. CIA Director Casey advised him to contact retired Army General Richard V. Seckert, who was acting as a for-hire contractor, who then found pilots to make these secret airdrops over Nicaragua. So you got this whole thing going on here. You've got guns being flown to Nicaragua, which is illegal. You've got drugs being flown to America, which is illegal. You've got the United States meddling in foreign affairs and rebel groups and trying to overthrow governments, which is highly illegal. All of this is covered up, but you've got these CIA people admitting that it was happening. And Barry Seal himself was an interesting figure in all of this. Who was Barry Seal? As a commercial 747 pilot, Barry Seal had lost his job with TWA when he was found loading a transport plane with close to 7 tons of plastic explosives. At his first trial, the judge declared it as a mistrial due to unspecified, quote, government misconduct. At the second trial, the judge dismissed the charges against Barry Seal. As you see, the explosives he was loading were destined for Cuba and were to be delivered to anti-Castro Cubans trained by the CIA. Theories were that Seal may have been working for the government as an independent contractor this entire time. So, following the ruin of his commercial carrier career, meaning Barry wasn't allowed to fly for anybody, not United, American, Spirit, none of them, Barry started smuggling marijuana and then escalated to working for the Colombian cocaine cartel, directly under the head of the cartel, Jorge Luis Ochoa. The Polk County Sheriff's Department, the Arkansas State Police, the FBI, and the IRS all knew about Barry Seal's activities. They were aware of federal ID numbers being altered on planes, substantial amounts of unrecorded cash flowing into local banks, and their informants were reporting that they saw drug shipments coming into the airport. And yet they did nothing. Well, that is until 1984, when Barry Seal was indicted in Florida on charges of money laundering and drug smuggling. After Barry was freed on bond, he flew directly to Washington, D.C., and was given an immediate appointment with 2 members of then Vice President Bush's Drug Task Force. The task force members then set up a meeting between Barry Seal and individuals from the Justice Department and the DEA. And at this point, Barry Seal agreed to become an undercover informant and collect evidence against the drug cartel. Now, Barry Seal's drug smuggling operation continued so that he could keep his cover. The operation was said to be now under DEA control, so this means the government did know about this the entire time. But what happened to the drugs that Barry brought into the United States? Where the drugs ended up while he was working for the DEA remains unanswered. The DEA also did not notify law enforcement authorities in Arkansas that Barry Seal was an informant working for the US government. So we don't know where the drugs went. Probably went into the noses of users who God knows how many people died from overdoses or were addicted to this stuff. And you got the face of the government publicly saying don't do drugs, and yet they're smuggling billions of dollars worth of drugs. I mean, it's just crooked, man. Barry Seal testified in 1983 that CIA agents rigged a camera to the back of his plane. He then stated that he used the camera to take a blurred photograph that was said to show Sandinista officials in Nicaragua helping local cocaine dealers load drugs into the plane. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North mentioned this arrangement with Barry Seal in his book Under Fire. President Ronald Reagan also displayed this photograph on national TV to get Congress to authorize more help for the Contras. But after this, Barry Seal was indicted again. He was able to work out an agreement to stay out of prison by testifying against the cartel, and his testimony assisted in bringing federal indictments against 11 men. These included 2 cartel leaders who were rumored to control 80% of the cocaine arriving into the United States. But in August of 1985, at a drug trial in Nevada, Barry Seal claimed he worked for both the CIA and the DEA. You see, his gross income since March 1984 was more than $700,000, and he had brought more than 1,500 pounds of cocaine into the United States. He also stated that the DEA had allowed him to keep $575,000 for one of his cocaine shipments. So while Barry Seal was working for the DEA and allegedly the CIA, state and federal officials in Arkansas were completely blocked from investigating him. Seal appeared in 1985 before the President's Committee on Organized Crime, where he described his work both as a drug runner and as a U.S. undercover operative working for the CIA. So soon, Barry Seal was facing charges in both Florida and Louisiana. But since he testified, the Florida judge reduced his sentence to 6 months of probation. The Louisiana judge added to the order that Barry Seal was not allowed to carry a firearm or hire bodyguards. He was to report daily to a Salvation Army halfway house in Baton Rouge at the same time every day for the length of his probation. Now, isn't that just strange? You've got this guy that's working for the government. He's working an extremely dangerous job undercover with the Colombian cartel, running drugs, pissing so many people off with these indictments. And yet a ruling from the government comes down on Barry Seal, and he's not allowed to hire bodyguards. He's not allowed to have protection. He's not allowed to carry a firearm to protect himself. And he's also supposed to report daily to this same halfway house at the same time of day. It's almost like they're setting him up to get whacked, right? You got to show up defenseless without any protection at this same spot every single day for the next 6 months, year, however long he was supposed to do it for. It should be no surprise then that Barry Seal was gunned down and killed less than 6 months after he was sentenced. But why was Barry Seal killed? What's the deal with this? But now we got to get back to the boys on the tracks. So let's go back to the very beginning. These two boys are found dead on the tracks, very close to Mena, to that airport, very, very close to where all of that huge hub of CIA, FBI, all of that was happening. They're found on these train tracks. The officials want to say it's a suicide or an accidental death so badly they rule out the homicide. Then it comes out that police officers in that town are involved in drug activity. Then it comes out that there's the CIA and drug running involved. And people are now wondering what the hell really happened to the boys on the tracks. Well, given the amount of drug trafficking that was occurring in that area, the most common theory and the most plausible theory is that those two boys stumbled across a drug drop or another type of drug trafficking transaction. Then people think they were simply murdered because of what they saw. And that's very plausible. I mean, in that town, you had people talking about the airplanes flying low, witnessing drugs being dropped. They always drop these drugs out in secluded areas like lots of trees, nature areas, dirt roads, train track areas where there weren't people. So Richard Garrett told Robert Stack on Unsolved Mysteries that he thought the boys may have seen something that they shouldn't have and were murdered because of drugs, a meth lab, or that the individuals involved in the drug production may have thought the boys had too much information. He also said that Saline County and the central Arkansas area is overrun with drug trafficking at an elevated level that extends into other states and counties. But who killed the boys? Well, we have a couple of suspects. There's the suspect, who's the main suspect, whose identity is still unknown. On August 17th, a police officer tried to stop a man who was walking on the road about 2 miles from where the boys were killed. When the officer turned on his lights, the man ran. On the day that the boys were murdered, a man fitting the same description was seen about 5 blocks from a railroad crossing that was close to the scene of the crime. Don Henry also mentioned to one of his friends before he was killed that he had been shot at one time when he was on the railroad tracks by a man in a white pickup. Don also said that there was a guy that said if he caught anyone in that area, he would chase them off the land and possibly kill them. Now, we have a list of people that were probably involved in these murders, but we don't know exactly who did what. You've got Dan Harmon, who was the prosecutor seen with the boys the day of the murder, Richard Garrett, who was the deputy prosecutor, Jim Steed, who was the sheriff, Jerry Campbell, who was a police officer, Kirk Lane, who was a police officer, and Danny Allen, who was another police officer. But out of all of those individuals I just named, Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell, the 2 police officers, are considered most likely to be the killers. You see, at the time of the boys' deaths, Kirk Lane was an undercover detective for the narcotics division of the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office. Previously, he'd worked at the Benton Police Department. Jay Campbell was a lieutenant with the Pulaski County Sheriff's Department, and they worked together at times, and sometimes their investigations crossed over into Saline County. Witness Ronnie Godwin, interviewed on June 20th, 1988, stated that on his way home on August 22nd or 23rd, 1988, he pulled over on the side of the road and observed a police car sitting in the driveway to the grocery store. He saw 2 men that he believed to be police officers, and one of the men was pushing a teenage boy up against a phone booth, and the other boy was lying or kneeling on the ground. The men put the boys in the back of the car and drove away. The car returned 5 to 10 minutes later, and the boys were not in the back anymore. The witness only saw something that looked like a garbage bag in the back seat. He also provided a diagram detailing the location of the individuals in relation to one another. The descriptions of the police matched Kirk Lane and Jay Campbell. Another witness, named Sandy Duncan, said she saw both of the boys at the grocery store at around 4 a.m. So Sandy is basically confirming this story of seeing police and the boys at the same grocery store at the same time frame on the same day. On February 21st, 1990, Mike Crook, another witness, gave a statement for the morning the boys' bodies were found. Someone he knew as Jerry told him that he was sitting across from the grocery store and saw 2 boys walk up to the grocery store, and 1 boy rode up on a motorcycle. The 3 of them were smoking a joint, and then the boy on the motorcycle rode off. Then an unmarked police car pulled up, and the 2 plainclothes police officers got out. Then an unmarked police car pulled up, and 2 plainclothes police officers got out. One of them was Kirk Lane, and the other one he didn't know, but he said he was a large man. The police officers and the boys then got into an argument. The police officers beat the boys unconscious and then threw their bodies into the back of their car. You got another witness now confirming what happened to these boys at this grocery store. But who did this? We still don't know. And now some closing thoughts. So, given the amount of drug trafficking occurring in the area and the alleged knowledge of government officials of the activities occurring at the Mena Intermountain Municipal Airport, are these agencies partially responsible for the boys' deaths? Is it the state and county officials that should be held accountable in the death of these two boys? What drives people to this level of corruption? Is it power, money, or fear? Or something else altogether? I don't know. But it's all too suspicious. You have Bill Clinton as the governor at the time saying he doesn't know anything about this drug smuggling and these drug activities that are happening in his state when you got billions of dollars worth of shit being smuggled in and out. And yet lots of people are saying they either told Bill Clinton or they were working closely with these organizations. He had to know. He had to know what was happening. And you've got all of this drug smuggling happening in the same area as the boys on the tracks. So if there was a smuggler out there and these two boys just happened to come across, imagine it like this. The two boys, Don and Henry, are walking along the train tracks. They're walking somewhere in the area. They turn around a corner and there's a couple guys with 1,000 pounds of cocaine sitting there. They just fell down from the sky, a drug shipment, a drug drop. What are the guys going to do? They're certainly not going to let these two witnesses bust them with thousands of pounds of drugs or however much they had. More than likely, they would kill them. And the fact is that the government was allowing this smuggling to go on. So in my mind, my personal thoughts are that the government knows who killed these boys. The government may have even had these boys killed, but that's why they never prosecuted anybody. I could even see, because the government were involved in these plots through the drug trafficking in Arkansas at the time, I could see somebody reporting to government officials, hey, these two boys saw all of these drugs and saw our faces. What do we do? And I could see somebody higher up saying, just take them out. I mean, they've taken out larger targets before, and to this day, these murders are unsolved. I mean, it just makes no sense. How have they not solved these crimes? You've got witness testimony claiming they all saw the same thing happening at the same place and the same people involved, and yet they have never been charged or anything. It's incredibly bizarre, and if the government is involved or is covering for the killers, or if they even had them killed themselves, that's disgusting and morally reprehensible. But yeah, comment your thoughts below if you're watching on YouTube. Be sure to follow me on Instagram at Conspiracy Files Podcast. I'm so happy to have everybody here. We're going to be back next week with another story. This is really exciting. I love talking about this stuff because this is stuff we need to be talking about that nobody talks about. We need to hold our damn government accountable. And not just our government, anybody who's corrupted. You got corruptible businessmen, you got corruptible people in the medical insurance industry, you got corruptible politicians, corruptible celebrities, corruptible people in every single country. Anybody with power needs to be held accountable. And what's the biggest way to hold them accountable? By learning about this shit, taking it in, and talking about it with people. Knowledge is power, my friends. Anyways, thank you so much for listening to me rant. We will be back next week with another episode of the Conspiracy Files. Keep that tinfoil hat on, and I'll catch you on the next one.